To go ahead and get us started. It's about 10:03. I know we'll have a few other folks joining, but let's get started so we can make sure we have enough time for questions. Good morning. My name is Charles Fields. I'm a regional program manager here at the California Endowment. I'm located in our Los Angeles offices. Thanks for participating in our webinar learning session on Redevelopment 2.0. If this is not the right webinar, you should get off and check your ticket. So we'll be on from 10 to 12 today. This is our first webinar for the Neighborhoods Implementation Team. I'll talk a little bit about that. But for folks who are new to us, I want to talk just a little bit provide a little context on the endowment, our Neighborhoods Implementation Team, and our focus, and then ultimately the focus of the webinar today, and then I'll hand it over to our esteemed presenters. So, as most folks probably know, but the endowment's a 16-year-old health conversion foundation. We care very deeply about the health of underserved Californians. We recently launched a new strategic plan called Building Healthy Communities, which has a focus on improving the health and opportunities in 14 communities throughout the state of California. Ultimately supporting youth and community organizing, policy advocacy and systems change work, research and communications, ultimately to improve the health in those communities. And we want to lift up those efforts for statewide public policy change. And so our work resides in three primary content areas. We talk about work in what's called our prevention work, which is really work focused on the Affordable Care Act and the effective implementation, work around schools, and ultimately increasing access to healthy food in schools and physical activity, increasing access to mental and physical health services in schools, and ultimately supporting enhanced and better school climate in schools, which has us doing a lot of work on suspensions and expulsions at schools. And our last content area of work is really our neighborhoods work, which really has a focus on healthy land use and decision making, safety and violence prevention efforts, and ultimately food justice efforts. Today's webinar is focused on our neighborhoods work and specifically on land use and decision making and its connection to health. And very specifically, a piece of legislation, Senate Bill 1, which is called Redevelopment 2.0. I just want to remind folks that the endowment does not do any lobbying, and so what you'll be receiving today is information on S1 Redevelopment 2.0, ultimately objective analysis, so folks can better understand the health impacts of that piece of legislation. And so our neighborhood, so I'm going to ask Cindy to kind of change the slide and just show our neighborhoods implementation team. We have a cross-departmental team here at the endowment, both folks who work on our, who are connected to one of our 14 communities, and folks who are doing our statewide public policy work. Special thanks to Ray Colmenar, Craig Martinez, Will Ng, and Jenny Chiang for their work in putting together the webinar, and especially Christine Cardenas, who is really kind of the brains and muscle behind this whole thing. So thank you very much. Next slide. Our work at the Neighborhoods Implementation Team, ultimately, we're an internal cross-departmental team that's really focused on making sure we share information internally around what's happening in both our local places and in our statewide team, and ultimately integrate that work as effectively as we can, and then really start to look for strategic opportunities where we can ultimately provide grants and leadership support. We do that in primarily three content areas: land use and decision making, which we'll focus primarily on today, safety and violence prevention, and ultimately food justice, increasing food access work. And so our webinar today, again, will focus on, again, talking about Senate Bill 1, Redevelopment 2.0. Our friends at Lane, the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, will provide some objective analysis on that piece of legislation and ultimately talk to us about what the health impacts are for that population. And then our good friend Robert Ogilvie with Change Labs will really draw a broad picture of the connection between health and land use. And so with that, I'm going to introduce both Robert, Roxana, and Jackie, and then hand it over to Robert to move forward with the webinar. So Robert Ogilvie serves as the Vice President for Strategic Engagement and Change Lab Solutions. He has served as a faculty member at the Department of City of Regional Planning at the University of California at Berkeley, and he co-leads the California Convergence Joint Use Policy Task Force and is a member of the editorial board of Community Development, Journal of Community Development Society. Robert's quite busy. He also holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. Roxanne Tynan, who is the executive director of Lane. She's been at Lane for over a decade, but is now the ED since 2012. She's also worked with City Council member Jackie Goldberg and started her illustrious career as a union organizer for Unite Here. And lastly, Jackie Cornejo is the director of Construction Careers Project. Before joining Lane, Jackie was a community organizer focusing on food access and tenants' rights issues in the Westlake community here in Los Angeles, as well as facilitating community planning projects in Westlake and South LA. So I want to thank all our presenters for their work today on the webinar. Robert, I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of start the webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Charles. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to just hold off for a second, though, let Craig Martinez give some housekeeping announcements. Then you'll hear from me briefly for about 15, 20 minutes, and then you'll hear from our colleagues at Lane. Over to you, Craig.
Good morning. Thank you, Robert. Just real quickly wanted to make a few announcements. If you're having any difficulty seeing the webinar, please feel free to email Christy Cardenas at the California Endowment. And we're going to hold off for questions and answers to the end of the session. So please, if you can look on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a little box that says Q&A. If you want to submit a question for any of our panelists or the presentations, please click on that button there, and the bottom of your screen will come up a little box. You type in your questions there and submit them, and at the end of them, I will actually be fielding those questions to our panelists. So if you have questions while they're talking, some interesting ideas come up, you have some suggestions, you want some clarity, please feel free to put that in a little box and send it to me, and we'll make sure we can get to as many of those as possible at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
I think that means it's my turn again. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Ogilvie, and I'm here in Oakland at Change Lab Solutions, formerly Public Health Law and Policy. I hope I'm not going to go through this too quickly. If I am, just tell me to slow down via the chat function, but I doubt that's going to be a problem. Again, to follow what Charles was saying, this is nonpartisan analysis like the endowment, who is one of our funders. We do not lobby. What I'm going to do here today are three quick things. Just orient everyone online to the relationship between the built and food environment and the chronic disease crisis we have in America. Most of you all are pretty aware of that, but I just want to start with a quick background. Then I'm going to get to what redevelopment was. Almost every state in the country, except California now, has redevelopment powers. They're called different things in different places. I don't know how many of you are dialing in from other states. Some states call it redevelopment. Some states still call it urban renewal. Some states call it community revitalization, so on. Arizona is still a little bit antediluvian, and they have some old-fashioned names that I'm not going to bring up. I'm going to talk about the powers that redevelopment agencies had and how they were being utilized to improve the sorts of communities that we're all really concerned about improving, especially the sorts of places that the endowment is focusing on with its Building Healthy Communities program. I'm going to give a quick snapshot of some of the benefits, health and financial benefits that can accrue to a town if these powers are used wisely. And I want to just start off by recognizing that these powers were not always used wisely by cities in the state of California, which is one of the reasons why Governor Brown got rid of redevelopment agencies. Then I'm going to turn it over to Lane, who are going to do some analysis and presentation of SB 1 and what's there on the table right now being proposed by Senator Steinberg and others. my key point here is that in doing away with redevelopment agencies, the state did away with some key powers that local governments really needed in order to build healthy and sustainable, or rebuild healthy and sustainable communities, and something needs to come in its place. And that's what we're talking about today. So you see the slide here that says the built and food environments in many places designed for disease. I don't think this is news to anyone. That designed for disease phrase is a phrase that I picked up from Angela Blackwell at PolicyLink. There are so many places in America that are built in such a way that physical activity, just as part of our daily life, is difficult, if not hazardous. And so people are not physically active. Because of budget cuts and other things, in a lot of neighborhoods, the neighborhood recreational facility is closed down or is unusable because of ill conditions, lack of repairs. In too many places, the condition of the housing is so degraded as to be hazardous to the health of the occupants. And then, of course, the food environment, the places in the neighborhood where people can go and buy food. This one here is in Oakland, not too far from my office. School children on the way to school in the morning will stop in there, and what is available is not fresh and not healthy, but it is affordable, and this is where a lot of people shop, and this is emblematic of too many neighborhoods. It's one of the factors leading to this situation that you see here. These two graphics, which are probably familiar to many of you on the line, represent changes in obesity rates in America over a 20-year, so one generation time frame, and it's pretty staggering. If you want to, you can go to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website and click through year by year to see the dramatic change, and it's gotten worse since 2010. But what I want to call attention to is the fact that in 2010, there's not a single state that had an obesity, well, let me restate that. In 2010, the states with the lowest obesity rates had rates much higher than any state in 1990. So that's been a profound shift in one generation. And among certain demographics, we're already starting to see lower lifespans. Recent studies have shown that white, male, and female Americans with less than a high school education have seen their lifespan decrease in this same 20-year period. For females, the lifespan has dropped from 73 to 68. For males, the lifespan has dropped from 70 to 67. First time that's ever happened in American history. And so we can expect to see more maps like this of cities and metropolitan areas around the country. This one was done of Contra Costa and Alameda County. It shows the difference in life expectancy by neighborhood. It's because of situations like this that you'll hear Tony Eiton and Bob Ross at the endowment say, tell me your zip code and I'll tell you how long you're going to live. And here we see a differential of over 16 years in neighborhoods in the same metropolitan area, separated by a few miles. And what's really different in these places here is the built and the food environment, the environment in which people live, and that condition the physical activity and food choices in their lives. Move on. So these environments are affected by public policy. I'm going to talk quickly about what some of those public policies are. Then I'm going to get on to redevelopment agencies, what they were, and the powers that they gave cities to make some of these policy choices. So you can see 6 different bullet points here. Policies that affect food, policies that affect the roadscape, policies that affect whether or not schoolyards and the recreational facilities that they contain are accessible to the community, even on weekends. Where do we develop? Do we develop on greenfields, i.e. low-density sprawl, or do we infill, increased density, increased mixed use? How do we pay for these changes? This is a big issue right now. And what should school children be fed at lunchtime? I want to just focus in on that one very quickly, because where we are starting to see progress in the fight against rising obesity rates is in childhood obesity in certain schools, where they've really focused their policy attention on the school environment as a whole and have changed menus and so on. So these are some policy decisions that are out there. In some cities, redevelopment agencies and their policies, as they used to exist, were being deployed to make those decisions in a way that had a positive impact, or at least set an environmental condition for potential positive impact on public health. This map was from the Strong Neighborhoods Initiative, which was a redevelopment initiative in San Jose, if you all were wondering where that was. But the powers were generic across the state. So tax increment financing, I believe Lane is going to talk about that a little bit. What that did was it gave redevelopment agencies an independent financing source that was independent of the city general fund, that they could bond out against over 20, 40-year periods, and then use that money for infrastructure redevelopment. They were supposed to improve blighted conditions. This was in the state law. They had master planning authority. They could mobilize other public funds, often community development block grants, and other sources of categorical funding. And they had eminent domain power within the redevelopment area. Again, want to recognize that some of this was controversial and some of this was used in ways that were, frankly, very detrimental to a lot of the neighborhoods that we were working in. But in recent years, there were enough examples around the state and around the country of redevelopment agencies that were starting to use these powers in a way that could create healthy environments, that some of us started to partner with some of them and started to push work forward that I'm going to highlight shortly now. And with SB 375 looming and the desire for healthy and sustainable infill development, by which I mean development that will improve air quality, improve quality affordable housing, help people have access to daily needs and services, whether they have a car or not, or can afford a car or not, and access to public transportation. With redevelopment agencies gone, there's a void in the planning and implementation powers of many cities to be able to do this. And this is one of the reasons why Senator Steinberg is pushing forward with SB 1. So to show you what are some of the things that we're doing or need to be done. So, for example, improving air quality. Here's a schoolyard next to a truck corridor. This is a problem. This is a problem that's been recognized across the state. But right now there's relatively little that cities have in their sort of power arsenal to be able to do something about this. Redevelopment agencies with their eminent domain power were starting to, and with their master planning power, were actually starting to reroute trucks and create truck corridors away from sensitive uses like this. I'm thinking about in Richmond, where the Ditching Dirty Diesel Collaborative had done a lot of work with the redevelopment agency to start moving that sort of work forward. Active transportation is another issue that's very important for healthy infill. Here is a walking and a cycle path that, as you can see, is connected to residential housing. Situations like this, where they're also connected to schools, connected to places of work, connected to places to shop, are really critical if we want people to be out and physically active. We need to give them the sort of infrastructure where the physical option is one that works for their daily lives, irrespective of their age. This can be an urban thing, or this can be a rural thing as well, where decrepit infrastructure like this around the country is now being reused and repurposed in this way. This example is from Tennessee. And again, this is the sort of thing that urban renewal agencies, redevelopment agencies, sometimes at the county level, sometimes at the local level, are spending their money and using their powers to push forward. And I just want to quickly talk about the fact that redevelopment agencies were not actually allowed to develop. The private sector has to do that. What they were allowed to do was incentivize certain types of development, and they were allowed to rebuild infrastructure. So I'm going to be focusing a lot on infrastructure. In California, they were also supposed to spend 20% of their tax increment, at least, on quality, affordable housing, and I'm going to mention that as well. So moving on from active transportation, redevelopment agencies have also spent a lot of money building public transportation infrastructure. And public transportation infrastructure has a whole lot of benefits, but from the public health perspective, I think one of the biggest ones is research is showing conclusively that the more you drive, the more you weigh, and that people who take public transit, because they have to be physically active to get to and from the transit, weigh less. This here is from Dick Jackson and Howie Frumkin's book, where they found a 10-pound differential among demographically identical white males. Other research is finding similar weight differentials. So by creating a situation in which people have to be physically active as part of their daily life, we have a pretty dramatic impact on their weight. I mentioned quality, affordable housing. This is a big issue in California now. Redevelopment was the #1 funder of affordable housing because that was written into state redevelopment law in the late 70s, and so there's a scramble now to try to replace that source of funding. Access to daily needs and services. Here we have a little parkette, which was built. Redevelopment agencies, I can think of a number of instances in Oakland, in San Jose, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, where money was being spent, directed in large part by the public processes on recreational facilities such as this, which they were and did spend their money on. It's not all urban inner city kind of thing. There are a lot of older suburban neighborhoods which in recent decades had begun redevelopment agencies, and it started to focus on retrofitting outmoded places such as this. I'm sure most of us are familiar with places that look like this, where the businesses have gone, sometimes lured away by the larger big box stores further out. And a lot of these are being eyed as village centers, as transit nodes, as places where infill development can happen, especially mixed-use infill development. But there needs to be some sort of funding source, and there needs to be some sort of land use power to do something about that. And then, of course, access to healthy food as well. I can think of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, which did a leakage analysis in the Bayview neighborhood to show that $900 million was being spent by residents of the neighborhood on food outside of the neighborhood because the neighborhood didn't have the sort of grocery options that the people needed. And with that analysis in pocket, they lured in a grocery store chain and helped put the financing together for a mixed-use development, much like the one you see here with grocery on the basement and housing on top. All of this has a public health benefit, but it also has an economic development and fiscal health benefit for the town. An example here, outside of California, albeit, but from the town of Hernando, which is a small town in Mississippi, where the mayor has become a big convert to this, and he said this is not just a feel-good thing, it's an economic development and fiscal health step that he has taken. I'm going to show you some of the policy interventions that Hernando has been involved in over the last couple of years. But among the huge impacts it's had is that the city has seen its insurance costs, its health insurance costs go down because there are less claims now being made by city employees, and this has led to big benefits for the taxpayers and for city employees who've also gotten a raise. And what they have done is farmers markets, community gardens, complete streets, well, you can read for yourself, through their redevelopment agency and others as well. They've adopted some of these policies and essentially created an environment in which, as we like to say, the healthier choice has become the easier choice. If you're more interested in how to do some of these things, feel free to look us up. And I am going to pass it over now. Sorry, that's me. That's how to get in touch with me. I'm going to pass it over to the folks at Lane. Jackie Cornejo is going to speak, and I believe Roxana is going to speak. And I think what I have to do is take the ball and move it, which I just did. And you guys are on.
Great. Can everybody hear me? Christy, I'm sure will let me know if not. I must admit, this is the first time I've done this in this format, so I'm a little technically challenged. My name is Roxana Tynan, and I am the Executive Director of LANE, LA Alliance for New Economy. And once our PowerPoint, here it is, sorry, I'm just, no, that's not it. Once our PowerPoint pops up, I'll start, but I was going to talk a little bit to, Jackie is saying to pass the ball to her. Sorry, let me do that. Hang on a second. Sorry, you guys, just I think I've just passed the ball. There we go. God damn it. No. Do I? Yes. No, there's no sound coming through. What we're gonna have to do I have to call back in? Call back in, yep. But I don't know what the number? The number is. Okay. It popped up when you first jumped in. That was it, right? Yeah. Okay, let's see if it's here.
Good morning again. This is Craig. We just wanted, as our presenters are uploading their presentation, wanted to remind you all to submit your questions and answers using the far right. Roxanne, if you wouldn't mind muting your phone in the interim as we upload it, we can also hear you. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, can I start now?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. So sorry, you guys, about this. If we can move to the first slide, Jackie. I think that we kind of got an overview a little bit about what we have, what redevelopment was. So I don't want to repeat some of the useful information that we've already heard so far. But I do want to explain maybe a little bit about how the tax increment financing works. It's one of the key ways in which redevelopment authorities have the tools to really provide both the architecture and the funding to implement the kinds of visions of development that I think we all care about. So if we can go to the next slide. And I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but I do think it's important to kind of understand how this tax increment financing works, because it's part of the challenge with trying to bring back redevelopment, is the concern that, in this case, the state has, that we are going to be, with new redevelopment authorities, eating into the state's tax base. And we would argue that's not the case. But what happens is, in most redevelopment, we set a baseline. Let's say I'm creating a redevelopment project in 2010. I set a baseline of what property tax is in 2010. And then I issue bonds based on what I think the increase in new property taxes is going to be as a result of investment and redevelopment. So those bonds, which are often 30 years or 50 years, then provide me as the redevelopment authority with the funds and the resources that I need to start investing in new projects, to build affordable housing, to focus in on healthy infrastructure. And so the case that we need to make is that, but for these kinds of investments, particularly in low-income communities, property values would not rise. And that because of these kinds of investments, property values will rise. A portion of that revenue stays to repay the bonds, and a portion of it goes back to the state and the county and the city. So feel free to ask any questions afterwards about how this works. The importance is really just to understand that this is part of the pushback we get when creating redevelopment, is the idea that somehow taxes are being taken away from, in this case, the state. And we really believe that this is a necessary way to increase property values in neighborhoods that really need this kind of investment. So next slide. So as you guys probably know, in 2011, all redevelopment authorities were eliminated. And the California Supreme Court upheld this dissolution of all the redevelopment authorities. It's a long story, probably not worth getting into, but part of it had to do with those redevelopment authorities in some parts of the state that were perhaps not as responsive to the kinds of concerns that Robert laid out for us. So what we lost was the largest and most stable source of affordable housing funding. We lost that financing mechanism to invest in new projects, and a really flexible tool to think about what are the key infrastructure investments, whether it's all the kinds of things that we've just seen in the previous presentation that are really going to improve health and quality of life for residents and communities that really need this investment the most. So next slide. So I'm going to pass this on to Jackie at this point to talk a little bit more about what SB1 can potentially do, right? It brings back these financing tools. It brings back the power of eminent domain, which enables a redevelopment agency to require that a property owner sell their property at market value. This can be controversial, but when it's used right, it can be a way to take, you know, really blighted pieces of property and turn it into something really useful for the community. This tool is also really enables us to think about what the impacts of climate change are and how to help our communities be more resilient in the face of that. And critically for us, too, it's about creating good family-supporting jobs, both in construction but also in the permanent jobs, whether it's a grocery store that we want to bring in or, you know, other retail or hotel. Any other of those permanent uses, it gives us an opportunity to really incentivize the creation of good jobs. And, you know, the last thing I'd say is that in addition to all and that was such a great presentation. I want to, you know, go share it really broadly because it paints such a clear picture about how the built environment impacts our health. The other thing that I think has a profound impact on the neighborhoods that we're all organizing in is low wages and poverty, which has obviously direct impacts on people's health in a whole range of ways, whether it's just straight up access to health benefits, whether it's not being able to afford decent and safe housing, not even being able to afford a bus pass in some cases. So it has a really broad impact. And I would say civic engagement too, and where redevelopment has functioned the best is where we have built a real engagement of neighborhood and community residents in having a voice about what the priorities of redevelopment should be in terms of jobs and affordable housing, parks, and really meeting neighborhood needs, thinking about our infrastructure. So where we've been able to organize and build a really great community process of participation, then redevelopment has been much more successful in meeting people's needs. And that's the kind of thing that we believe is possible if we can bring back redevelopment in the state. So Jackie, I'm going to pass it to you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to go a little bit into sort of what's the statewide environmental context that is sort of the impetus for this effort around SB1, which I'll be going into momentarily. So I want to start off talking about sort of AB 32. So AB 32 was sort of this landmark climate change legislation that was ironically passed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the goal of it is to make sure that we lower our emission standards to 1990 levels by 2020. So that's sort of the first step in making sure that we really address the problems of climate change for Californians. Step two is talking about SB 375, which is another landmark piece of legislation, also sponsored by Darrell Steinberg, and it's what really created sort of using the really empowered local governments to create the planning and land use tools to be able to achieve the targets set forth by AB 32. So what SB 375 did essentially is that it required that each region that has a metropolitan planning organization or an MPO, for those in Southern California, it's the Southern California Association of Governments. For the Bay Area, I believe it's MTC. And it requires them to set greenhouse gas emission targets. As part of it is that they have to make sure that they create a sustainable community investment strategy, sustainable community investment strategy to make sure that the regional transportation plans achieve those targets, which really gives the framework for what I'll be talking about momentarily, as well as sort of creating these transit priority areas to make sure that we do responsible infill development. And then the next step is SB1. Is really about being able to provide the funding to implement these plans. So what is SB1? So SB1, it's the Sustainable Communities Investment Authority. Apologies, it doesn't have a really sexy name, but essentially what SB1 does is that it gives cities and counties the tools to be able to create sustainable investment in local communities with this framework set forth by SB 375. Again, it's about promoting responsible development near transit, making sure that we have good quality jobs attached to this investment, so both in construction and permanent jobs, and also creating safe, walkable communities, which also includes, rural areas as well. So I'm going to go into the three key components that are part of this legislation or bill. Essentially, SB1 would allow a city or a city and county or a special district or a county alone to create a sustainable community investment authority, which would have 5-member boards that would be accountable to community. What's key about this is that it allows, SB1 would allow the sustainable community investment authorities to use tax increment finance to give local areas the tools to invest in responsible development. So it would sort of reawaken some of the elements of redevelopment law that are currently dormant due to the dissolution of redevelopment agencies. So the investment areas. The investment areas could include some of the following. So transit priority areas, again, a framework that was set forth in SB 375, which includes light rail, heavy rail, high-speed rail, bus depots, and other high-usage transit corridors. So, for example, it's ensuring that there's, or prioritizing development within a half mile of a transit stop, and then with high-speed rails within a mile of a transit stop. And so for LA County, why we also think this is really important is because for those of you who don't already know, but we have a major sales tax that was approved by voters in 2008 called Measure R. It's going to dramatically change the way our county looks like over the next 25, 30 years. And if we don't have the tools to not just invest in areas where transit will be built, we could potentially have sort of a hodgepodge of development that will increase congestion, won't have good jobs, and all the other things that are necessary to improve the quality of life for people. Again, it's also the small walkable communities within rural areas, and then also clean manufacturing districts. So the framework for this is to ensure that we incentivize or promote clean manufacturing, clean energy manufacturing that will allow us to reduce our energy consumption. And what the authorities are required to do is create an investment plan. And there are a couple key components to the investment plan. One, that the Sustainable Community Investment Plan Authority, must include a jobs plan. The bill has language that says that construction jobs must pay prevailing wages. It empowers local authorities to make sure that permanent jobs pay a living wage. Also, ensuring that there's funding for community outreach, local hire, and job training. We think about all the other components that go into making sure that people are job ready, such as life skills, especially when we're talking about folks coming out of the criminal justice system or out of the foster care system or veterans. And also the implementation strategy to really make sure how this is actually going to be carried out. The other key piece that I think is really exciting, especially for us who've been been working on affordable housing issues for a very long time, is this issue of no net loss of affordable housing. So essentially, it creates a baseline year, and every 5 years, the controller has the ability to audit and ensure that units occupied by low-income households are not being reduced during this period of the Sustainable Community Investment Area Plan. And if that number is reduced, then the authority has 2 years to ensure that there's replacement housing. And then, again, when we're talking about making sure that we have a reliable source of funding for affordable housing, the SB1 requires that at least 25% of tax increment finance must be allocated towards the development of affordable housing. So it's another key tool that we lost when redevelopment agencies were dissolved. So I'm going to go into just other considerations, other things to think about, as we open it up for Q&A, and also just what's sort of the political context that this is happening in. And one is, is the governor ready to bring back tax increment finance and redevelopment? And so unfortunately, not a whole lot of people really know where the governor stands on a lot of things. And so, the previous legislative session where this was originally introduced as SB 1156, the governor in his veto statement said, state is just not ready for redevelopment. In his May revise, which was released last week, said, pointed out to the cost savings associated with not having redevelopment agencies. But the real question is, what are we foregoing, in terms of economic development, job creation, et cetera, because of his sort of strong hatred of redevelopment agencies. The other thing is, sort of thinking about what are the proposals that are on the table in the state assembly. So again, we have a champion in the state Senate with Darrell Steinberg, but on the state assembly, we're really looking at sort of what is on the table right now. And there's actually a series of bills that are on the table, sponsored primarily by the Assembly Redevelopment Working Group. And I'll name just a few that I think are important as they focus on bringing back another type of version of redevelopment, with a sort of similar blight finding, sort of similar framework that we had before, and then also looking at infrastructure districts as well. So there's AB 1080, which is a bill sponsored by Assemblymember Alejo, which is the one that we're really keeping our eye on because of the fact that it's the most similar. However, it doesn't contain any explicit language around job standards or compliance with state prevailing wage laws. And so the other piece of it that we're really keeping our eye on is the fact that it states that that it could potentially outsource some of its functions to a private entity in order to make sure that affordable housing projects pencil in. Of course, we want to make sure that government functions stay within the authority and not outsourced to a private entity where there might be less oversight or accountability. I'll just briefly mention two other bills, and it's AB 243, which is sponsored by Assemblymember Dickinson, focusing on the creation of infrastructure districts, as well as AB 690, which also creates sort of this hybrid version of jobs and infrastructure districts to make sure that we use tax increment to be able to address in development in areas of high unemployment. The other consideration is also, will the budget negotiations impact SB1's chances? And I just mentioned that in the May revise, it's focused on the cost savings associated with with not having redevelopment and having the tax increment go back to the general fund. But again, what are we foregoing in terms of economic development that we need in areas that are still, feeling the effects of the recession? And the other thing that we're also really monitoring is also the process of for the revenues for cap and trade. We just also found out last week that the governor prefers that the money go back into to the general fund as opposed to it going to projects that will mitigate the effects of environmental degradation in disadvantaged communities and funding for transportation and bike and pet improvements, et cetera. And then also just in general, what are some of the other tools available to communities that will help us meet our affordable housing and also, really our climate change goals. So that's also sort of a big question. If SB 1 doesn't pass or any of these other bills don't pass, what really is available to local governments? The real answer is very little, but what can we make do? So I'll just briefly share this timeline right now for where the bill is at. So on March 13th of this year, it was approved through the Senate Government and Finance Committee. And April 23rd, it was approved through the Senate Transportation and Housing Committee. And this week, it was waived out of appropriations, and it should be out of suspense I think either today or tomorrow, and we will soon know when it will go to the Senate floor. And so we are very confident as to where the bill is at in the Senate. Again, where we will, as Lane, really be monitoring is where the bill is at in the Assembly and whether we can have some real leadership within the within the Assembly Redevelopment Group to really sort of coalesce all these ideas, through all these other bills that are also on the table to make sure that we get something that the governor signs. The other thing I forgot to mention in terms of how we hope that the bill will really catch the governor's attention is, one, the focus on creating transit priority areas near high-speed rail stops. High-speed rail is something he really cares about. And the other key piece is the process for successor and oversight boards that are overseeing the dissolution of redevelopment agencies for them to obtain the certificate of completion. So before, the bill has language that says that before a sustainable community investment authority can be established, the city and county entity that is creating it must obtain a certificate of completion. So again, so that before we start this new process, the old process needs to have ended. And so that's where I'll leave it at for now. And thank you. And I'll pass it over to Craig again.
Thank you, Jackie and Robert. Excuse me. The presentations were very informative, and we thank you for number one, presenting this information to us and providing us an opportunity to have us ask a few questions. Again, I wanted to remind panelists that attendees that they're able to submit questions and answers using the question and answer tab on the right-hand side of your screen. We had a few questions coming in, so just wanted to go ahead and jump right into it. First of all, wanted to, and when you do ask for questions, please let us know if we can't figure out who you would like for us to ask the question to. If you could indicate in your question, that would be helpful. First question I wanted to pass along is from Robert. Wanted you to talk a little bit about the potential benefits for the health of rural communities with respect to redevelopment. In particular, if you could talk a little bit about what is needed with respect with infrastructure for rural communities and what SB 1 could potentially mean for those communities.
Okay. Let me just, I love the presentation from Lane, and I think that I just want to reemphasize that I and my organization is not really looking for redevelopment to come back, but we're looking for something better. Because the way redevelopment worked in too many places, especially a lot of rural places, and to get to that answer, was really problematic. Lane has led the way in negotiating community benefits in large urban redevelopment areas like the ones in Los Angeles, and we have really lost a lot. So let me just put that out there. So I'm looking for something better. There's a conflict going on in this state right now between where power is going to lie, sort of a federalist conflict. Is it going to be in the state or is it going to be in local government? And now that the governor is in charge of the state government, he wants the power to lie there. And that has stripped locals of important capacity. For rural communities, there were a few sort of outstanding examples of people working in redevelopment agencies who were really doing infill in a context-sensitive way that was creating the potential for transit-oriented development, creating economically vital urban cores, and I think that those examples, I'm thinking specifically here of Clovis in Fresno County. Her name is not coming to my mind, but I'm going to keep thinking, and hopefully it'll pop in before the end of this presentation. If you say the words infill and if you say the words density in a lot of rural communities, people are going to panic and they're not going to want to get involved. So she didn't say that. She talked about reviving Old Town, even though there never had been an Old Town. And so they were creating this Old Town, and if you saw me, you'd see me doing the air quotes now, which was an old small town kind of feel. That was the vernacular that they built in. But it was 2 or 3 stories. It was mixed use. It was walkable. It was dense. And it was thriving. And I imagine it still is thriving. I haven't been to Clovis in 2 years. Clovis is one of those towns that had the dead sort of mall that I showed. But a few miles away was Old Town, which was thriving. So to me, that is the model, creating those sort of context-sensitive neighborhoods. And then figuring out what the active transportation infrastructure looks like in the place that people like. I know in a lot of small towns, a lot of rural areas, people don't really necessarily want sidewalks or the sort of urban fabric that we think of, but there can be trails, there can be horse trails, there can be bike trails, there can be various things like that. You might need some eminent domain power to acquire those and stitch those together and help underwrite some of the infrastructure development, but those are the sorts of things that I see redevelopment it was doing and can do again, or whatever the successor is. It's heard it pretty clearly out of the state that don't ever use the word redevelopment again in the State House because the governor's never going to go for that. So, whatever the new name is that comes out of the SB1 process.
Thank you, Robert. The next question is for Roxana and Jackie. Can you all describe the actual mechanism of transfers of money of SB1? In particular, our attendees are interested in knowing how exactly does this money get disseminated to the local level?
Good question. If I can also just say, I want to underscore what Robert is saying in terms of, redevelopment. We're using that as a kind of shorthand, but it's one of the reasons the bill is called the Sustainable Communities Investment Act is that we really do want this to be a reinvention. In communities where folks got really engaged in the process, they were able to do great things with these tools. Sorry, that wasn't always the case, and so we think there are a ton of great opportunities here to do great things with these tools. So what happens is that when an initial authority is created, right, and Jackie kind of walked us through the different steps that authority would have to go through before it gets created. Previous redevelopment has to be dissolved and put on the shelf, and then the city or the county city authority needs to have done its AB 375 plan to show how they're going to meet climate change goals and smart growth goals, and then there's a jobs plan. Then the authority begins. Usually the way it begins is by doing a bond issue. It goes out to the bond market and it says, this is how much our investment we project will increase taxes. We'll get 40 cents of the dollar of every new tax dollar that's created, and that money will be used to repay these bonds. And so the money, the tax money continues to go straight to the county and the state as it always would, and then comes back to the authority, the 40 cents on the dollar if there is a county city authority created, comes back to the authority to repay debts and to make new investments. So I hope that's a clear answer. And I want to underscore, too, that while we certainly have to do some work to really make the case to the governor about the value of these investments and how they support his overall goals for economic development, we're confident that there is, support in the legislature for this, and that this year's attempt to get the governor to see the broader value of this has a lot more going for it than last year's did. There are a lot more people engaged in the conversation about what we've lost and what we can regain if we engage in sustainable community investment in the right way. So, I think there's a lot of great possibilities here.
Thank you, Roxana. Now a question from Danielle Bergstrom. How are the small walkable communities and clean manufacturing districts defined? If rural areas lack basic bike ped infrastructure, will they lose small walkable communities distinction?
Jackie, do you have an answer for that?
Oh, I had it on mute. Apologies. Could you repeat the question again?
Sure. This is a question from Danielle Bergstrom. How are the small walkable communities and clean manufacturing districts defined? And then the question following is, if rural areas lack basic ped bike infrastructure, will they lose small walkable community distinctions?
Well, the language in the bill currently is very broad in that so that it allows for the local authorities that would be established to really set what that looks like. And so that's really the shorthand answer for that question. SB1 really generally gives a framework for what a Sustainable Community Investment Authority would have. But some of the details as to how a clean manufacturing district will look like, how, in terms of figuring out what a small walkable community would look like, which is really more specific to rural areas. And I saw that Robert answered that question as to whether it means that it's either one or the other in terms of bikeability and walkability, et cetera. But that, again, it's the focus of this bill is to really give local communities the power to be able to reinvest in their areas, and so that's why that language is it's fairly broad.
Thank you. We have a question from a number of participants who are interested in knowing about or learning more about the relationships between SB1 and the California Homes and Jobs Act, SB 391. If you can describe that a little bit, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so I'm a little less familiar with SB 391, which is the Saulnier's bill. But as far as I see, given that we've been, sort of following that bill because many of our affordable housing allies are actively, working on that, is that we see it as sort of complementary to SB1 in that the biggest challenge that we have is that we don't have enough money usually for affordable housing development, and so the more money the better. And that's especially important in this case because the pool of money for SB1 might be a little bit smaller. Also, given the fact that it excludes funding that would now go to schools and also firefighter services. So it protects those sources of funding. So the pool of money for SB1, if it were to pass, would be a lot smaller. So SB 391 could potentially be, like I said, a complementary bill.
Thank you. We have a question from Robbie Clark. Can you say more about the purpose of eminent domain and how it is strengthened in this law?
I can try and take that, and maybe Jackie can jump in. It's not strengthened in the law. I think that what this law does, the way to think about this law overall is that it is a focused, a much better focused set of investment tools. So the basic power which the city currently has to some degree for public projects, right? If I want to build a school, I can require that a property owner sell me their property at market rate in order to build the school. What bringing this tool back for redevelopment allows us to do is to require property owners to sell for a project that's not necessarily a public one, like a school or a park, but for an economic development project. So it doesn't change how eminent domain works, the new bill. What the new bill does, though, and again, it's why it's so important, as Robert was saying, not to think of it, and probably we should train ourselves never to use the phrase redevelopment again, but why it's so different is that the Sustainable Communities Investment Act is really focused in on transit-oriented developments for urban areas, for walkable, and that does not exclude bikeable communities in more rural areas, and really focused in on the fundamental questions of implementing our smart growth and healthy environment agenda and our jobs and affordable housing agenda. So it's a much more focused arena, and it has more protections than we have had before in terms of protecting the community's voice and power in the process. So for those reasons, while the fundamental way in which you would use eminent domain in this new context would be the same, it's going to be focused in a much, I think, more effective way for our communities. Anyway, yeah, it'll be focused in a way that I think is going to function much better for our communities.
Hey, Craig, if I can just add quickly to that, everything Roxana said. The impetus, the fundamental impetus for redevelopment agencies over the decades they existed was to increase property values and to increase taxes collected locally. That's what it really was about on the fiscal level. And so that gave an incentive to redevelopment agencies to do certain things that we've become familiar with across the state of California, like big box retail and auto malls. There's less of a focus on that in this new bill and more of a focus on healthy infill development. So that's, I think, a big difference. Eminent domain power exists right now in a number of city agencies. It's just that redevelopment agencies, which had them to do certain things, have gone away. The proposal is for the eminent domain to continue to exist as defined in California redevelopment law in whatever the successor agencies are called. Sorry about the noise outside.
That's a great reminder. That's a great way of distinguishing what we had before to what we're aiming to create now.
Great, thank you. Attendees are reminded if they want to submit questions, please submit it using the functionality on the right-hand side of your screen. We have a question again from Danielle Bergstrom. Wanted to know a little bit more about the 5-member boards that are going to be created, and what are the accountability mechanisms that are going to be in place to make sure that they're reflecting community needs?
That's a great question, and Jackie, jump in if I don't cover all the issues here. Previously, at least the redevelopment agency board were appointed by the mayor and city council. And they served at the pleasure of the mayor, who could ask them to resign when he or she wanted. In this case, assuming that a city and county come together to create a Sustainable Communities Authority, the county would pick 2 people, appoint 2 people. The city would appoint 2 people, and those 4 would elect a 5th person. And what's important from our perspective is that those 5 people would then serve fixed terms. So it would give them a much greater degree of freedom and independence from, the inevitable realities and of electeds feeling under pressure by X or Y developer to support a given project. It provides a little bit of distance. But the fundamental question of accountability is about the kind of work that you guys are all doing and that we try and do here with our allies, which is organizing. As with the previous, with redevelopment, the Sustainable Communities Investment Authority will have a public process on projects, so an opportunity for people to engage. And when folks organize and push to really participate in those conversations, then we can really have an impact. And so part of, our goal with this call is to have people really think about what are the key local goals and vision that people have for how they want to invest in their area, and how to really start getting prepared now with our, community residents who are active to be able to articulate that goal and those goals and that vision for what we want our communities to be like. So real accountability, no matter how many public meetings you build in, if there isn't an organizing infrastructure to really ensure that, we are focused on jobs and infrastructure and affordable housing and parks for communities that need it most, if people aren't engaged in that conversation both now and once we pass the bill, it's not going to be as effective. So it really requires participation to work.
Great. Thank you. We have another question from an attendee wanting to know if you all have any information on why all the bills with any fiscal implications are in suspense. And if you can just describe a little bit for some of our attendees who may not be familiar what that means in the policy world, if you guys can describe what that means and sort of what your impressions are with respect to the bills.
I'll just start off here. With the easy answer, which is that the state continues to be in fiscal crisis. We don't have enough revenue in this state to do what the public wants. California, since the passage of Proposition 13, has been in a situation where we've got a very unstable revenue source. We don't rely on property tax the way many other states do because we can't. And so the governor's trying to see through that, and he's made it really clear since day one that the budget is his number one issue in balancing the state budget and having it on a steady trajectory, and then anything else is secondary. So I think that's why all of these fiscal bills are suspended. And then just quickly to add to that, and that's something we need to deal with. We've been talking about SB1 and replacing what used to be called redevelopment here, but the bigger question is getting the state out of the fiscal crisis it's in and onto shore or fiscal footing so that we're not all sort of tearing at each other and fighting over a shrinking pie.
Yeah, and then just a technical, for folks who are not familiar with the legislative, Robert's answer is correct, and folks not familiar with the legislative process, essentially what it means when a bill goes into a suspension file is that they're considered all in one hearing after the state budget has been prepared. And once the Appropriations Committee specifically has a better sense of whether there's available revenue. So that's really what the technical definition is.
Thank you. Wanted to highlight, there's a couple questions that are happening in our chat room, and just for the benefit of all attendees, we had a question from Rye asking about the funds being raised locally, whether or not they'd be able to leverage other funding sources. For example, could it be used for local match for larger transportation grants? And Robert, I know you provided an answer in the chat, but if you wouldn't mind kind of addressing that for the benefit of all of our attendees.
Sorry, I was on mute. Rye asked if the funds would be raised locally, and I assume he is referring to tax increment because that's the funds that we're talking about here. And yes, tax increment is raised locally if there is a tax increment at all. And I just want to get to that. In many of the redevelopment agencies in the state, there wasn't much of a tax increment. The goal of redevelopment was to create a situation in which the property values within the redevelopment area increased. Consultants would be hired. They would run models based on different types of infrastructure investment that would forecast tax increment, and then the redevelopment agency area would be created. But in many instances, there wasn't really much tax increment that was actually realized. In some of the bigger places now, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and especially San Jose, there was actually a lot of tax increment, and it was collected locally. But it took decades for that to accrue to a point where any major investment could take place. And as we look at creating successor agencies that have tax increment power, we're going to be looking at decades again if the same model is followed before there's any reasonable pool of money to do a lot with it. So yes, that's collected locally, if that's what you're asking about. It's spent locally. You asked, could the funds be used to leverage other funding sources? For example, could they be used for local match for larger transportation grant? I don't know what the law says about that. My guess is that things would work differently in different locales depending on the skill and the imagination of the staff. What the CRA in LA was able to figure out how to do because of some of the brilliant staff they had there who were continually being prompted by Lane and others was very different than what some of the smaller redevelopment agencies around the state were able to figure out how to do, and I suspect that that'll continue to be the case.
Yeah, and to underscore that, the way to change that story is to have folks engaged at this very early stage in how this law gets developed and passed and implemented. I mean, it really gives us an opportunity to be in as community residents on the ground and activists and people engaged in these conversations on the ground floor of a new process, because the devil's in the details. The only way this stuff works is when there's a ton of sunlight shone upon it and a lot of folks engaged in the conversation. So in LA, the CRA was able to leverage, new market tax credits. It was able to access, community development block grant funds and use those to build out a pool of dollars. It was able to access other dollars and leverage the resources they had to look for more. But I think Robert's right. It's about creativity and, folks in each community really taking ownership of this as a new opportunity.
Great, thank you. At this point, we don't have any additional questions. If someone wants to submit a last-minute question for our panelists, please feel free to do so. If we don't have any further questions, I might just want to ask each one of our panelists to maybe have some closing thoughts and some closing suggestions for additional information, or just kind of give us your perspective of the conversations. And maybe we can start with Robert,
who has just unmuted himself. Thanks, Craig. Thanks, everyone, for listening in. And I really appreciate the comments about sunlight and organizing and applying pressure. And again, I'm not going to be lobbying here, TCE funders, so I'm not going to speak specifically about SB1, but I think that those of us who have the community interest at heart, and I see that there are a number of state employees who are among the attendees, and I include you in that group. It's really important to think bigger picture here and think about how we create power or recreate power at the local level and bring resources to the local level to help build healthy and sustainable communities where people have good jobs and where people don't get priced out of their neighborhood because the infill that we're bringing about has made the neighborhood so much more desirable that they can't afford it. And how we make sure we don't, again, pit local economic development against the schools, which is what, in effect, happened in the past with the way tax increment was collected and held on to over long periods of time. That's not good for the state for the long term. There are lots of examples in other states. So the irony is that tax increment was initially created in California, but other states have figured out ways to use it in ways that didn't create the sort of intergovernmental tensions that we had here in the state of California. So I think that learning from other states and some of those best practices as we move forward is it's really important. We're in not sure how long this window of opportunity is going to last, but with a 2/3 majority of one party in both houses, I think we're in a place where we can make some profound changes to the fiscal structure of the state for our long-term benefit, and it's important for us to advocate for some of those and to bring examples of best practices from elsewhere.
Thank you, Robert. Roxana, Jackie, do you have any closing comments or thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I want to underscore what Robert's saying. No piece of policy is ever a magic bullet, as I know all of you on this call realize. It's, from our perspective, any policy that we get excited about is, and I don't mean to be too repetitive, but is an opportunity to organize, an opportunity to really engage people in feeling and actually having some ownership over what gets built in their communities. And I think that voice is really the critical piece for us. And, if organizing doesn't happen, then this tool, unfortunately, could be what it was before, which is you rub money on land and you hope something grows, but usually the property owner is the one who grows, right? And what we're trying to do in thinking about opportunities and chances that this legislation provides is a lot of folks have been engaged in thinking and developing this legislation who aren't the usual suspects, who are really thinking about things from a more community-based perspective. And so I think this offers a great opportunity. I think there's also been a lot of thought into, by focusing what investment opportunities could be under the Sustainable Communities Investment Act, we're also ensuring that we are not taking money from schools, that we are not taking money from fire districts. So it might be a little less of a percentage of each dollar that can be taken for these investments, but it also ensures that critical piece that Robert laid out, that we're not goring anybody's ox here. But again, I can't say it enough times. I think this is a great opportunity because I feel like there's a very good chance we can move this, a great opportunity for people to think about what are the core land use and development and investment goals that people have, and how can we be organizing to be prepared to articulate that voice, get folks that we think are great representatives onto these authorities, and then stay engaged to ensure that they continue to meet community goals.
Yeah, this is Jackie. I just want to thank everyone who is on the call for this webinar. And I think what's really exciting about the time we're in right now is that it's really an opportunity to reevaluate how planning and development has been happening in our communities for a long time, and how this is an opportunity to really think about how can we make places healthier from an economic and environmental perspective, and that it's possible to have communities that are walkable, bikeable, and that where people can live near transit and not at the expense of any of the other things that we care about deeply, and also ensuring that when development comes into a community, that those who've been there since the very beginning, when times have been good and times have been rough, are able to actually benefit from how we're reimagining development.
Great. Thank you for those closing comments, and thank you to all the attendees who have some very thoughtful questions and our participants who had some very thoughtful answers. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Will Ing, who's going to make a few announcements and make some closing remarks. Will?
Thanks. Thanks, Craig, and thanks to everyone who's taken the time and expressed the interest in the webinar. We wanted to thank everyone for their time. We've really appreciated the conversation, both the presenters and the perspectives and the expertise that you've brought, as well as the questions and answers. And I think kind of both the number and the breadth and the range of questions that we've seen, really kind of speak to the broader interest in both. Since we're not using redevelopment, I'll say, sustainable communities and healthy land use. And, we heard both at our endowment convening, Building Healthy Communities convening last year, and in other conversations that, people are really interested in getting information, hearing what other people are doing, learning how to connect with each other. And we hope this webinar was a good start. You heard Charles mention at the beginning of this that our neighborhoods work group, one of our goals there actually is a lot of information sharing and connections. And so what we're planning on doing is sometime in July, launching a learning community of sorts around the issue of land use. We're still kind of putting the final touches on that, so we're asking folks to stay tuned. But everyone that's participating on this webinar should be getting information on that in the pretty near future. So unless there are other comments or additions from my endowment colleagues, I think that wraps us up. Okay, great. No other questions? Then thanks again, everyone, for the questions, for the conversation, and for your participation.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.